this Future Transform recording, we discussed action research with Professor Damian Bebell, learning from him what technologies are best suited to what kinds of action research. And it was a wide ranging conversation with a great deal of personal insight and a lot of practical discoveries. I should say, though, that about two-thirds of the way through the session, the room where I was lost power. In fact, the building where I was lost power. And so you can see me quickly scurrying around as I raced from room to room, hallway to hallway, building to building, until I finally found a spot where I could sit down, plug in my laptop, and have power. So there's a comical visual part there, if you like, but the main purpose, the main function of this recording is to have our conversation about action research and technology. I hope you enjoy. Please feel free to leave comments and, of course, to like and subscribe. Let me welcome everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to have you here today. We have a really, really great guest talking about a fascinating subject. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So, to kick things off, let me introduce our guest. Damian Bebell is coming to you. If you've gotten our email, we got a précis of his biography. He is here to speak about action research in higher education, and specifically how to use technology in action research. So what action research is, what kind of technologies we can use is what we'll be talking about. Damian, to introduce yourself, we have an unusual tradition here in the forum. We ask people to describe what they're going to be working on for the next year. So we try to avoid the academic obituary style of what you've done so far. But what lies ahead for you for the next 12 months?
Wow, that's a great way to start, and I appreciate that. And it's really wonderful to be here. And thank you for the invitation, and a shout out to Ruben Putendera for making the connection. And he can take all responsibility or blame depending on how the next 55 minutes go. So, I'm a research professor at Boston College, and so, over the next year, I don't think I'll be teaching any classes. I'll be in the position where I'll be conducting and designing studies across a spectrum of projects with different funders and organizations. And across all of those projects, the goal that I have is as you rightly said, Brian, as kind of the leveraging technology and thinking about how we bring technology to study education itself and using the tools that we've provided in our classrooms and in our universities and in our K-12 institutions as a vehicle for reflection. And so, I get excited about the weeds, honestly, and the kinds of resources that we use for collecting data and the kinds of tools we use for making analysis and even how we share and report data. And all of that has changed pretty dramatically across my career. And even in the last, 5 years, we've seen really dramatic changes in the opportunity to collect information via technology, analyze it, and share it back. And so you talked about action research. And action research is kind of the I think of it as almost like the decolonization of educational research into classrooms and for professors and teachers to take those what were once ivory tower resources and apply them. So as I'm doing formal, academic research with partners like Nord Anglia Education, where we're studying a metacognitive program they're implementing in 27 schools right now in, I think, 15 different countries, we're doing very traditional academic research, pre and post designs of surveys and assessments and observations and controlling variables and making beautiful regression plots. But alongside of that work, we're also sort of empowering teachers and leaders within schools with some of those tools to conduct their own individual inquiries through action and using the tools and kind of ideas of action research. So, continuing the work with Nord Anglia internationally across this K-12 landscape, which really gets at sort of the heart of how do we implement new technologies in really busy, successful places? And how do we change practice and what happens when that happens? And I also am really lucky to have a partnership with Apple Education. And I support Apple Distinguished Schools, both higher ed, but again, in fairness, a lot of my work has been in the K-12 landscape. Um, but again, helping schools understand, define, measure, and share success on their own terms, and bringing the tools of educational measurement to that process. And that goes across things as one cool project in Bataan, the Philippines, is the
Mm.
very first generation of teachers across public schools in the Philippines is getting a laptop computer. Up
Mhm.
until now, teachers have not had any consistent technology device provided by the government or school
Ah,
system. They've been
uh.
using their own personal devices, making it work. This is part of an effort, we of bringing, a really powerful technology into a place where the tradition is having paper manila outlines of each lesson and pulling them out of a file cabinet and hanging them on the board to teach for that lesson. What's going to happen over the next year as teachers get their first, open up the MacBook and are able to connect through the internet and open up these worlds. And it's not like
Mm.
the teachers are amazing pedagogically. They've just been missing these resources. They are some of the
Mm.
best trained and prepared teachers. It's just been an access issue. All the way through working with some of the, the most um, well established and privileged schools of the world, like the Escola Concept school system in Brazil, where we're leveraging action research and Apple Watches and sensors and working with neuroscientists on like the very cutting edge of educational technology. So we really run the gamut by sort of applying the tools of traditional research with the amazing technology that's continuing to evolve to help schools chart where they've been, but more importantly, better dream for what's in the future. So that's pretty good for a research professor. You usually only speak in 60 and 90-minute intervals. So that's probably good to at least get the conversation rolling. And I'm really glad to be here and just kick around all kinds of ideas. But I'll just say I'm coming at this from a data geek research perspective, and I'm
Yes.
not the pedagogical expert, I think, that, or futurist that I find myself in the company of. So I'm really excited to learn and discuss some of these thoughts.
Well, we are here for you, and your achievements as well as your humility and sense of humor. Um, the Friends, if you're new to the forum, again, I'm going to ask Damien a question or two to get the ball rolling. But the rest of this is for you, for your questions and your thoughts. So please, definitely feel free to start, firing up in the chat. And by the way, just in the chat, we believe in supporting our community here. I just want to let everyone know that Karen Belnier just got her degree. She just got her doctorate. So woo! Yes, Karen, woo! I'm sorry. This just came up, and I just wanted to celebrate because I'm so proud of her. That is wonderful. And now she's going to probably mute the screen so we can't see her blushing so much. I'm so proud of you, Karen. That is great. That is great. Damien, I'm curious about a few things, a lot of things, but one of them is your point about action research as a kind of decolonizing. Can you say more about that? That really struck me. What? How does that work?
Yeah, when if the gray hairs don't betray it, I started as an educational researcher in the late 90s at Boston College, believe it or not, as a graduate student. And my first job was using this technology called an OpScan 10. And the OpScan 10 was an amazing device that you would find at any university, any major or even small university or college for decades. And they were the scanning machine. And so
Mm,
my job at Boston College was running the scanning machine. The number two pencils were sharpened,
yeah,
sending the mail
yeah,
out around the world for research studies, and we'd wait with bated breath for the boxes of scan forms to come in, hopefully not too crumpled, iron them out and run them through the machine and put in some obtuse Fortran code, and it
yeah.
would spit out you know, some data for us. And it was pretty amazing at the time. But we were realizing schools were, so if you wanted to do a survey, if you were a school leader, if you had a small university, or you had, you're in a small institution and you wanted to understand student perception, you had to kind of find someone with these tools and these resources. And if you wanted to design a survey, you had to find a psychometrician and you had to make sure all of these pieces. And it took a fair amount of effort and money and resources to collect data, analyze that data, and share it back. All of those steps were resource heavy. And it didn't take us long sharpening pencils literally and thinking about the internet. And I thought, there have to be, so many connected teachers out there. What if we use the internet to survey them instead of these forms? And so this idea that, I really appreciate these small incremental jumps in technology. So we were designing these very first web-based surveys, and we had to find schools that had internet capacity and enough devices for people to actually take them. And that's one of the ways I ended up kind of becoming associated with one-to-one technologies and studying emergent tech, was simply because I was opportunistic trying to find a research setting that had enough tech to play around with these, in the weeds, nuts and bolts details of how we might collect surveys through the internet. The point being, right, is that these incremental technologies have really allowed any of us, any professor, any classroom teacher to be able to do what, a grad student might have had access to at an R1 university a generation ago. And so what's really amazing to me is that we're getting out of the way. Like I can't go into, a school in Mumbai, India and get off the plane and see the school mission statement and meet the leaders and hang out with the kids for a few days and tell them how to measure their success on their own terms. And that's been kind of the mindset, honestly, of educational research for since its inception. And
Mm.
what I'm hoping and what I see evidence of is that as technology has sort of created a democratization of these tools, that the questions are no longer these top-down, what do guys like me think is important when I get to Mumbai, India? I'm just fascinated by how many people, how many people share your, so how many people are at your breakfast table? Those are the kinds of questions I'm asking and, trying to get this background on kids' lives. And that's the least important thing to their teachers. So it really allows, I think technology has been a vehicle for empowering the end user with research, and action research is kind of the model and guides that existed in the old days that we've just been able to quote Seymour Papert, put these jet engines on the stagecoach. And sometimes it does feel a little bit like that, but people like Ruben, people like yourself, futurist conversations like this give us the opportunity to kind of dream let's not just stick it at the substitution level. Let's just not create 5 response choices in an online survey because that's all the technology in 1956 allowed in the IBM scanner. We can actually create the first thing I did when we created the online survey is like, how old are you? 0, 1, 2, 3. We could have every age. We could actually ask the date someone was born and have how many days they were old. I mean, just it just changed everything for us. So yeah.
This is the democratizing access to these kind of tools. That's fantastic. Um, thank you, Daniel. Let me ask uh, again a more present-oriented question, which is what are some of the technologies that you find now give you the most bang for the buck? You know,
Yeah.
is
I
it
mean, again, I'm a little self-conscious with the current audience of futurists because so much, I mean, simplicity can go a long way. And, simply reaching out to a student or to your faculty or to your community and asking simple questions with clear response choices or open response choices and collating that information at one point in time or over multiple points in time, to me is like, just creating ingredients that you can feast on later. And there's a formative and summative aspect of that. So as simple as it is, just reaching out via whatever survey tool you might use, whether it's a Google form, whether it's a Qualtrics type situation, whether it's one of an independent app that uses different kinds of interfaces, not making assumptions about your own educational practices or policies and the way they're impacting your stakeholders or your students. And so as simple as that sounds, just using simple tools like Class Dojo or a Google form to make sure that you're on the same page as everyone else you're working with, or you're not making assumptions about really simple things. Now, that said, there are some really cool technologies that are emerging, and I am so like excited about this app called Hollow Tracker that's founded by Ake Ing and Tom Collins in Singapore, and it's a web-based app. Ruben actually has some familiarity with it because we blew it out at a learning design conference in Brazil about 16 months ago, and we had about
Mm.
300 people all download the app and actually use it. But in my work, it takes classroom observations or peer-to-peer reflections, and we create a framework, right? Doesn't matter the framework. I'm almost agnostic to the framework, right? I've just landed in Mumbai, India. I don't know what success is in this setting, whether it's higher ed or a K-12. However, the school can tell me their mission. They can import whatever it is they're interested in looking at or tracking. It could be, behavioral if it's younger kids. It could be social emotional. It could have cognitive components. But there's one use case where the teachers or the instructors are using this to sort of track different thematic elements that occur over time in a course or over a period of time. And in a classroom in a K-12 setting, it can also sometimes have a peer-to-peer aspect. And what's cool about this is when we talk about measuring something, it sharpens our thinking. First of all, right? It helps us understand what we mean and what we don't mean. And so when we bring a team together and we say, okay, what do we actually care about tracking in our classroom? If we care about engagement with students, what does that really look like? What does that mean to everyone in this room? And trying to get to the bottom of what that actually might look like and what are those characteristics. And then using a tool like this to define it and let the examples self-populate. And so you actually start to understand what these themes actually mean across a community, and you can point to what behaviors and indicators look like. And of course, as a data scientist, you can mine that information and you can look for patterns and trends, and that, male students in their freshman and sophomore year have more attention difficulties or difficulty staying on task when they're in class when it's before noon on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and before 10 on Thursdays and Friday. I mean, we can get to that granularity of data. And then there's this application of reporting. The app actually then ties in to different AI and LLM engines to be able to take that data and create like a report for a given student, a cohort of students, or actually look at how tracks are changing over time for an individual or a group. And so, in our work in Brazil, one of my outcomes as an evaluator or researcher was looking at how much time this saved. So we were just looking at sheer efficiency. We looked at quality as well, and the quality was really high actually. And the teachers loved the fact they could put it in like a Dr. Seuss, rhyming scheme with a click for the
Mm.
students' outcome reports if they chose to. Or, I prefer the E. E. Cummings or T.S. Eliot. But in any case, we really could help tell the story of success on the school's terms using these technologies. So it's an
Mm.
exciting time. I mean, we're in a golden age, honestly, for educational reflection and research. So,
Mm, it really must be. Thank you. Thank you. I have more questions, but I'd really like to hear from everybody else, and that means we have more questions that are already coming up. By the way, Mark Corbett Wilson, our friend on the West Coast, says that he appreciates your beautiful shaker room in the background.
thank you.
Yeah, let me just
1720. New England.
Oh,
Gotta love
let me just adjust the view a little bit so that people can see that.
it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. We have so friends, we please use the chat for your questions, or you can use the Q&A box. And we have a question that refers back to your work, Damien, on K through 12 and technology,
Mhm.
from our good friend upstate New York, Ben Harwood, who asks this: how did the rapid adoption of digital platforms like Google Classroom during the COVID-19 pandemic reshape the trajectory of K through 12 education? And
Mhm.
what lasting progress did it inspire in how students learn with and engage with technology?
Wow, that's such a good question. Thank you, Ben, and appreciate that. Um, it's been interesting, the whole history of educational technology in K-12 and higher ed has honestly been written by the statisticians and the psychometricians. The
Mm,
whole way we kind of even refer to educational technology is like the ratio of devices to student, right? And we can go back to the 80s. And again, I'll name check Seymour Papert again, who's
yeah.
looms large in my head and in this field. Had, suggested that in the 1980s, we had about 125 students in K-12 sharing one device. That was a typical educational environment in the United States. And Seymour suggested that one-to-one was actually the magic. And so throughout the 80s, through the 90s, we tracked 10 to 1, 6 to 1, 3 to 1. And then COVID hit, and the entire global educational system essentially went one to one, whether it was with a phone, an iPad, a Chromebook, some version of that. And schools that were already kind of thinking in a futuristic way and had those devices obviously were able to make those transitions much more smoothly than schools that were really trying to beg and borrow and figure out that infrastructure. And
Mm,
so, right at the beginning, you didn't have a very even playing field. Let's be honest, right? We had schools that, and like at the university level, we had schools that were fairly well prepared as anyone could be given the circumstances.
mm,
And then schools that were sort of completely blindsided and did not have an infrastructure or support. And so, we're starting with a fairly uneven even playing field. And then as COVID continued, I think we saw those differences actually exacerbate. And in my work, we pivoted instantly to looking at broadband connectivity in the community. And I worked a lot in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in Hamilton County, Tennessee, which actually has the nation's fastest and largest community broadband initiative. And we worked with the university there and some great scholars and did quantitative, qualitative research on the impacts and importance of not only having the one-to-one magic ratio for students, but high-speed connectivity at home that was not just affordable, but was actually truly free. And that was a 10-year contract to the family. So it wasn't just like here's 3 free months and then the billing started. It was truly remarkable what we were able to see there. And so again, how schools evolved over that period led to many different patterns and shapes and results. But overall, we saw some schools were able to take it in stride, and their vision, their infrastructure, their futuristic thinking, the models that they live by allowed them to kind of take those challenges and say, today, what was best from COVID? What did we learn from online learning and from, flipped classrooms and all of the things that we had to do by necessity that we can now build on? And so if you are looking for examples of schools in K-12 and higher ed that are stronger significantly because of that experience, there's many. But there are also some, and this is so true of American education, that are even worse off than they started. And that further exacerbated. They invested in crummy devices because it's all they could afford or get. They used them poorly, and there's a knee-jerk reaction as schools reopened that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater because we're sick of we have this
mm,
PTSD type feeling in many communities toward educational technology in general. And I think to bring us up to the current point before we get to the next future forward question is that, today I think communities are really struggling with the disentanglement of personal devices that kids have and technology in general and educational technology in the classroom. And I
Mm,
think that's something that, is we flooded the world with educational technology. And I think there was a lot of the world wasn't ready. There's been pushback. There's been sort of the tide has receded again. And it's pretty muddy in a lot of places. There's definitely these amazing, ports and beacons. However, it is there's a lot of muddy ground, and I think a lot of boats are just kind of sitting in the mud flat right now, kind of
mm,
waiting for direction.
mm. That's a that's a wonderful answer. Friends, first, if you haven't seen this, we did a whole series of programs during the pandemic, on the pandemic. So in the archive, you can see both things as they happened, as well as a reflection of it. Um, Second, I admire Damien so much, not only your love of prepared and his focus on student creativity and agency, but also on the sheer diversity and variety of K through 12 outcomes. Ben, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but Ben works in education. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is how that COVID experience in K through 12 then shapes the students who are becoming undergraduates and graduate students now.
It's funny how that happens, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed. Thank you, Ben, for the great question. And Damien, thank you for the awesome answer. Um, we have another question coming in from Carolyn Hawley, who asks this: what opportunities and pitfalls do you think generative AI tools present educators for data analysis, particularly in generating actionable insights by quickly turning around the data and analytics they have access to in their courses?
Ooh. Oh, could you see the last few hairs fall out of my there with that?
No,
You know,
no.
if so, a couple people have noted in the chat, my shaker background, and you're close. It is a shaker chair, but my background is actually a 17 Georgian colonial house that they were going to bulldoze it outside of Boston. So I took it and I took it all apart. And because it is pre-industrial, it's only made by pegs and everything fit back together. So I built it back together, and now this is my home office, and I'm delighted to be thinking about technology from a very long angle, having had to straighten out rose head nails and recut old glass and put this whole place back together. That
Wow.
said, when we think about AI, I'm initially like, we've had language tools. I remember one of the first conversations I had was, you know, learning that in the late 60s, computers could score student essays with a higher efficiency than a teacher.
In what
But
year?
we still, ETS and the testing companies still had to hire teachers because the politics of just having, robots essentially or scoring. So we've had, amazing technologies available for a long time to look at data and particularly open response data that is very cumbersome and really time consuming to make sense of. So, we're looking at a partnership right now with a university that has like 40,000 students. And we want to ask open response questions. We want to go deep. We just don't want to have them, doing sliding scales and heat maps. We want them to really, tell us something or send in a video or audio. And that data is so time consuming and challenging to work with. And so we are, you know, researchers who are successful for a long career tend to be conservative. And so we don't always run out and jump on the very first technology. So I've been a little slow on the uptake, to be honest, but I have a number of graduate students, particularly Sina Zine, who is with us at Boston College as a doctoral candidate, who, we're building these models and asking the very question you get at by comparing it to what we're doing kind of the old-fashioned way. And so we're comparing how the tools stack up against our grad students and our professors in the work we're doing. And so far, I have to say there's a lot of room for efficiencies and coding and summary. But in terms of getting insights that really connect with the culture of a place and what's unique and what that stakeholder is looking for, I haven't personally witnessed much of that. That's not to say in 6 months we're not going to see that, and it's not to say that simply the structure of our prompts have been inefficient, and we're still learning.
Well, first of all, I mean, in the chat, people are deeply impressed by your furniture and your house. So I just want to share that right away. As am I. It's a wonderful work of rescue.
It's
And
never ever come up. I've used this room for hundreds of conversations over the years. So this is a very attentive, thoughtful group. I can tell here. It's so funny. It's the first thing I would have noticed. I'm like, is that?
the forum community is clearly after your heart, Damien, but also the forum community is deeply special. We had a follow-up question to this, and thank you, Carolyn, for the question, and Damien, thank you for the great answer. Um, and Brent Enders, our friend at the American University of Armenia, he wants to press a little further on AI to give your thoughts. So perhaps those last few hairs can then stand up straight. And so he wants to know what the best way is to conduct and publish or share action research design with AI.
Mhm.
He adds
Yeah,
up.
I think originally, Brian, you had sort of suggested that as the title
Yeah,
for today, and I honestly, and as you remember, my reaction was sort of to shy away because it isn't something that I feel. One of the problems of being a research professor is you feel like everything that you share, particularly in a forum, needs to be cited and really grounded. And a lot of my friends who are, pedagogical experts have no problem just telling us what they think and what they feel on these topics. But it's really hard for me to sort of talk without having the data to show the effectiveness of some of these programs and to speak from that, because that is truly the angle with which I'm looking at it with. That said, there are some really, I think in this room, I know Ruben, for example, has personal and good professional experience. So, Ruben, this could be a prompt for you to share some of what you're doing and the conversations you've had the last few days with some of my grad students at Boston College. Actually, we were lucky to have Ruben on our campus for a symposium over the last few days. So, thanks again, Ruben, for being there. But to just sort of frame this more generally, I see the greatest capacity currently in being able to just handle large amounts of open response information, to be able to assist in helping us extract meaningful information around, just using it more in a filtering capacity rather than the ultimate reality of a data set or its structure. And again, it's probably, I'm fair to say it could be my inexperience or lack of prompts. I can also kind of hand it over to Ruben, who I think is, thought about this. And I've also appreciate the way Ruben has, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the SAMRA model,
absolutely.
but Ruben's latest thinking around the SAMRA model with, generative AI and large language models is that, substitution might not just be a net equality, that there could be some real serious corrosive elements for employing substitution level, you know, big tools like AI or things like that. So Ruben, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Before Ruben steps on the spot, though, if I could just for one bit of clarification, so for dealing with open-ended responses, so that might be, for example, if I gave a survey where I asked people, um, tell me your favorite moment of the past year or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So as
Yes.
opposed
One of my
to
favorite questions, what, if anything, for you personally, or however we want to set it up, has led you not to do the thing that we're trying to make you do? So whether it's impact and, like use this new technology that we've given you, use the amazing professional learning and support system, use the new parking garage that we had built that no one wants to park at, whatever it is, like that kind of an open response question tends to yield just a wide variance of perspectives and response. And for an analyst, those kinds of questions can be really difficult. It's not like saying, which of the following concepts or, in math, or they're just
yeah,
so wide open there. And particularly in a university setting, by the time a kid gets to be about 8 or 9, they realize they can just type anything in that field. And they often do. And so using a tool like that can very much give us a real bonus there. And that's the kind of questions that we find it's really effective, not just open responsive questions in a survey, but particularly those ones that are casting a really broad kind of net. And they're the most fun to ask and analyze, really, because that's where we get surprises. And that's why we're doing action research. Because if we already kind of knew, and that's the decolonization piece, like that's where like we're going to be surprised, and I'm not going to name any schools by name, but I was visiting an institution within the last year, and students started sharing things in that survey that were really interesting and really important, and we were able to take that information and again, that was kind of slipping through the cracks otherwise, and we
Mm.
can use AI tools to shorten and make that process much easier and much more efficient, so we can actually rely on those tools as practitioners and not just be the researchers at places like Boston College and Boston University. Nice to have you from across town with us today. And you know, truly create something that can be cultural. You could ask that question every 6 weeks. You could create a culture of being reflective. And the tools allow you not to be burdened or overly burdened by using that information. And we see it with the classroom observations. And we also see it with that example, like I mentioned with HoloTracker, just the open response, wide open kinds of things. A teacher might track about a given student, or a professor might, track or note about a given course or student at a given time. So when we have that real wide open field, it's
Yeah.
cumbersome, it's challenging, it's hard to know where to start. We end up having to get PhDs in, quantitative research, and no one really wants to do that, and for most of us. So this is a way that allows people to have that cultural benefit and use that tool without being burdened by so much of the the, the math and research behind it.
Well, thank you for that glorious clarification, which I really appreciate. And and of course, Brent, thank you for the excellent question. One could say excellent prompt. Okay, Ruben, you've had a chance to rest and prepare. Over to you, sir.
All right. So thanks, Brian. First, Damien, thank you so much for coming in today. It feels like it was, only yesterday that we were together watching Paul Simon at the Wang, and it feels that way. And actually, it was 2 days ago. Okay. So anyhow, but so to the question, it's very interesting to see what you can do nowadays with large language models and qualitative analysis. And I know as Rachel also asked about, how the type of research tool has been advanced. So I'd say right now there's a point at which if you're doing traditional coding, if you're doing the type of look for frequency, examine, the more obvious what we call first order patterns, first order trends, etc., that can be rather well automated using large language models. And I've had some good success doing that. It's a lot faster, cheaper, and frankly, a lot less pain for everybody than to have a room full of graduate students poring over stacks and stacks of questionnaires, interviews, and so on. And the quality, I've done, a standard test, A versus B. What do I get from the coding done by humans versus the coding done by LLMs? And for that type of basic model, it works quite well. Things get more interesting as you go into deeper or more complex forms of qualitative analysis. And that is, as Damien hinted, one of my big topics these days. And that is, how do you look, if you're, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, Johnny Saldana has an amazing book on a coding manual for qualitative researchers. He just retired recently, I believe, but I strongly recommend picking up the latest edition of his book. And he describes all sorts of ways of approaching qualitative analysis that go well beyond the standard, what you used to always do in NuDist or equivalent tools. And I'm looking at seeing how many of those can be implemented and how well they can be implemented using LLMs. And there's much more varied. I'm working right now, for instance. Can you take some of the ones that take the idea of use the equivalent of dramatic roles and use that as a parameter for how you code questionnaires, interviews, and so on? And it is doable, but to get really good results, it still is taking some work. So it's very much an open topic and a fascinating one. So I agree with Damian, it's early days, as I say. So if all you're doing is basic sentiment analysis, for instance, is relatively easy to do. Basic, as I say, patterns, trends. But for instance, suppose you're talking about second order pattern, right? So you're not looking at something that's evident from the text itself, but something you have to have some more knowledge of the cultural context and so on. That still requires a fair bit of human intervention at this point, and just throwing it at the LLM tends not to yield good results. But again, we're learning. We're developing better LLMs, we're developing better techniques. We can inform the LLM with additional documents. One of the things I'm looking at, for instance, to go back to Damian's idea of decolonization, is what could somebody in a different context that has nothing to do with Damian's context or my context or anybody else who happens to be on this forum's context, but what could they want to bring into a cultural context that might not be obvious to any of us, and yet would form part of what would be involved in qualitative analysis. So those are some of the topics. And again, I want to make sure we can get back to Damian because I think he's got a world of things to contribute. But very briefly, Damian's point about SAMR and the substitution level and using generative AI. Yeah, one of the things that can sometimes happen, and this has actually come up in some other conversations on the forum, is if you do a simple substitution, take exactly the same task and throw a large language model at it and say, well, do the same thing except using the ChatGPT or whatever large language model you may prefer, Claude, even an open source one, etc. You find that the task loses meaning. Now, you could challenge how much meaning did the task have before, and that might be a good question. But let's assume it had some significance, some meaning before. Sometimes saying, oh, we'll just throw the LLM here, and instead of having it's a standard, let's say it's a standard 5-paragraph essay, and you used to give certain feedback, and now you just have the LLM give the feedback. And you find that frequently in those cases, something goes away in the process. And you find that either you were doing something that is not being done by the LLM, but that you didn't realize you were doing, or the test becomes meaningless to the student because the assistance to the LLM, given by the LLM, effectively takes away whatever the student was putting into it. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use LLMs. That means you need to redesign the task at levels higher than what appears to be basic substitution. In other words, unlike with some other technologies, I find that basic substitution using generative AI can be, the term I've used, but I'm not the only one using it, is erosive to what you get out of the task. And by the way, it's not just Gen AI. You saw this during the pandemic when people said, oh, I'll just substitute Zoom naively for sitting in my classroom. So instead of sitting in a classroom for 8 hours, which I'm not a big fan of, but okay, you sit the kid in front of a camera for 8 hours and you suddenly found that really did not work well. It exhausted the kid. And there are all sorts of reasons why that naive substitution doesn't work. But it becomes at the end of the day saying, well, whatever might have been gained from having the kid sitting in your classroom for 8 hours, which, as I say, is not the best idea to begin with, was eroded away by the naive substitutive use of suddenly Zoom. So it's something to watch out for multiple technologies, but it does crop up fairly frequently in the context of Gen AI. So, but I want to give the stage back to Damian. And Brian, do you mind if I ask Damian a question that I know is, on my mind and would love to?
Well, only if I can ask you a quick question.
Please do.
There was a request in the chat for that citation to the book you were talking about. Was that the coding manual
yeah.
for cooperative researchers by Johnny Saldana?
Yep. Give me a second. I can copy it right here. Here it is. And I believe we're on the 4th edition is the most recent one.
Yeah.
Anyhow, check to see whichever is the most recent. I believe it's the 4th, but I won't swear to that. Here we
Oh, it's okay. People have pounced on this in the chat already.
Oh, okay. Well, I might as well finish.
So thank you for that citation. And
There you go. So yeah, I strongly recommend it. As I say, even if you're familiar with qualitative research, there's a wealth of good thinking in there. So,
excellent.
but the question I wanted to ask Damien is one that he knows I'm thinking about that we touched upon, but since the conversation is just starting, I'd love to hear what he thinks about, which is Damien, you and I had an absolutely wonderful few days watching and seeing what people in K-12 are doing with action research. And the whole concept of metacognition in the context of action research. Any thoughts on where higher ed might go in that context? And anywhere in higher ed, from community colleges through universities, through grad school, whatever comes to your mind. So what's on your
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Ruben, and what I've been thinking about. Obviously, I mean, I've been in higher ed my whole life and my whole career. Um, it is, I think, there is so much opportunity there, and I'm reminded again. I know we're thinking about really forward thinking technologies and resources, and that gets exciting, and we've joked about the shiny phenomenon, Ruben, for for a long time. um, I had a professor, he's still around, Dr. Larry Ludlow, and he was a University of Chicago psychometrician. And I don't know if how many of you have met old school University of Chicago psychometricians, but they're they're they like psychometrics, and they kind of have a pretty straightforward worldview from that era, and they're really good at mathematical structures and analysis. And Larry Ludlow taught statistics for over 30 years at Boston College to graduate students and occasionally undergrads. And our measurement department is housed in the School of Education. And so we have psych department students, social science students, and education students that all have to take a fair amount of statistics courses to get through their various degree programs. And for many, it's a real slog. It is the worst part of graduate school. It was the thing they thought they were avoiding by going into social sciences. And we hit them square in the head with things like general linear modeling and psychometrics too, and Roche modeling for fun and profit. And so Larry, as a professor, we all are used to the university course evaluations. I think starting in the mid 90s, Larry started having his students draw a picture of their learning experience at the end of each course. And he collected them and he coded them and he's collected them for years. And as a psychometrician, he started looking at patterns and trends, and he used it as a lifelong reflection. And he also pulled in his course evaluation ratings, which he was very suspect of as a true psychometrician, because they weren't at the level and the scales weren't that great and the questions weren't as valid as he might like. But all of that said, he was able to create, and this is such a psychometrician thing to do, a database of student sentiment that included the qualitative pictures and the themes and trends he had coded from them, whether it was a night class, whether it was a morning class, whether the students were advanced grad students, and how did their drawings and their course evaluations contribute to their experience and perception of being in these really tough classes. And he created the most amazing data set that was so rich that, with the technologies he had when I was his graduate student, he had a seminar where he just gave it all to us as grad students. And we'd learn the theories of measurement using that data set. And what it created was this reflective environment where he, as a practitioner, was always open and was always thinking about the student perception and experience, and using what data he could and the skills that were natural to him to be able to quantify and build on that in a formative way, and also actually, just so more amongst professional colleagues, in a really summative way. Like
Yeah.
imagine going up for tenure and having 800 different drawings over 6 years showing your evolution of the pedagogy and your students' engagement levels is reflected through their own eyes and pictures, and then have the ratings that associate with that. So, as simple as it sounds, the technology is always changing, right, Ruben? There's always opportunities, but personal journey plus action research, I think, can equate a more satisfied professor. Yeah, I'll get a link because we presented this a couple times actually, and he's written about this process. Goes back the 90s through the aughts, through the tens. He retired a few years ago, and I bet we'd probably find him somewhere in Nova Scotia right now thinking about sailing. But he still has all of the drawings, and they're all been scanned. And I mean, it's an amazing testament to a career, but it's what data can we get from our stakeholders, and what meaning can we extract in ways that are both personal. And so, Ruben, that's a really long answer, but I think one that we can all get a little inspiration from, because the technology doesn't have to be an obstacle to use data and necessarily be reflective. And that's more true every passing moment we're in higher ed. So I love the work that Dr. Ludlow did. I don't know if I'm thick-skinned enough to do it throughout my own career. I've tried it a few times.
Mm.
Your mileage may vary, but it's really a testament to using research and the tools of action research to improve not only maybe your teaching and your outcomes, but better understanding yourself. Because I would guess all of us are really deeply invested in who we are as professors and instructors, and the way we interact with students means a tremendous amount to all of us. So bringing any data that we can help inform that, and use technology to make that faster and easier and more efficient, I think we have a lot of opportunities ahead in higher ed, particularly. And very last point, in K-12, my students are under the age of 18. I have to
Yeah.
knock on their parents' door and get parent permission to get their voice if it's not anonymized in most parts of the world. I love working in higher ed where 18-year-olds can just check the box themselves, and we don't have to ask their mom or dad whether we can use their survey results in our study.
That's a huge difference. Ruben, thank you for that really good question. And Damien, thank you for that excursion of an answer, which is so inspiring and so practical at the same time. Friends, just so you know, in case you're wondering what was going on in my video feed, the room I was in, all the power went out, including power to my laptop. The emergency lights went on, and I had to go walk through the building with my laptop while Damien was speaking so thoughtfully. I've gone over to another building on the campus. I plugged into a room. I don't know whose room this is, but the power is on. So if I have to move again, that's going to be why. Um, Damien, thank you for sharing the link in the chat. Um, we have about 2 minutes left, and our friend Rochelle Furness had a question that might be one that we've started touching on. But I want to make sure she gets a chance to ask this. She asked, I have not used CACTA software, so that's CAQDA software recently. How have generative AI advances enhanced this type of research? So I think you've been talking a bit about this, um, but if you want to say a bit more.
Yeah, could you repeat that question? What was the
Yeah,
resource?
sure. She said she hasn't been using Cacta resources. I'm just pronouncing this CAQDA software recently. So that's
Yeah,
computer assisted qualitative data analysis software, I believe.
yeah.
Uh, and then she asks, how have generative AI advances enhanced this type of research tool? And I wonder, Rachel, perhaps Damien's answer about open-ended questions is one answer. But, Damien, if you'd like
And
to say more about
I repeat that, and I think there's, again, it's evolving very quickly. I'm naturally, as a guy who rebuilt a 300-year-old house, a little bit skeptical and conservative when I'm not always the early adopter that Ruben might be with these technologies. So I would think that would be a nice put, to the forum if anyone has any final words or insights around those resources, either in the chat But again, it's been a real privilege to share some time with you, and I actually have really learned a bit myself. I've taken a lot of notes the old-fashioned way and a few digitally, and I have some links open. So thank you again.
Well, then, thank you, Rochelle. And I'm sorry if I called you Rachel before. We have the top of the hour now. It's 3 p.m. here on the East Coast. And Damien, I have more questions, and I'm sure everyone in the audience has more questions. And I think everyone in the audience would like to invite you to join them in research projects. But I have to say thank you so much for being an eye-opening, exciting, passionate, thoughtful guest. This is terrific, terrific work. What's the best way, Damien, that we can keep up with you if you want to learn more about what you're doing?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn, which, is probably where I would post the most types of work and exciting things. And I would love to connect with anyone who wants to share and continue thinking about this. I'm also pretty lucky that I am the only Damian Bebell in the entire planet still. So I'm pretty easy to find. And I welcome, again, continuing the conversation in any capacity or forum. As a friend of Ruben, and I love to talk and think about things like this. So thank you, Brian, and thank you all. It's a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for that answer. Thank you for being a great guest. And thank you to everybody for such a great conversation with wonderful questions and wonderful thoughts. And thank you also for putting up with me shambling across this campus. Just to wrap up, we have segments coming up throughout the summer and into the fall on all kinds of topics. So you can head to the forum website to learn more, or check your email if you're on a distribution list. I hope that depending on where you are geographically, I hope you are enjoying a pleasant June, but also I hope you are all safe and sound. Thank you all for being with us and thinking together today. We'll see you next time online. Take care. Bye bye.